Hi everyone, today I'm joined by Elyse Sainty. Elyse is the Director of Impact Investing at Social Ventures Australia. She leads Social Ventures Australia's social impact bond related work and was instrumental in the development of each of the social impact bonds that Social Ventures Australia has launched to date, including Australia's very first social impact bond. A qualified actuary, Elyse worked in financial services for 2 decades before moving across into this world of social impact. Elyse, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolute pleasure.
So I'm really curious. I'd love to hear a little bit about your current role in social impact. Tell us about what that role looks like and what do you really enjoy about it?
Sure. So I work for a non-profit organisation, which is sort of different in and of itself. It's called Social Ventures Australia. We're about 100 FTEs, so and only about 20 years old, so not very large and not very old. And within SVA, there is an impact investing team, which is about 10 of us. And I sit within that team. Yeah, we sit alongside, we've got a consulting practice, and we also incubate new sort of ventures in the social space. So sort of a really diverse amount of work that the organisation does. And I think, one of the things I really enjoy, just before I get onto the specifics of my role, is that really, for me, that was a really different work environment to sort of go into that non-profit world and be surrounded by people who are just really passionate about, what difference we're trying to make in the world, I guess. So, no small aspirations, just sort of solve.
Change the world.
Exactly, change the world. In Australia, where all people can thrive, I think is our sort of objective. And that sort of nimbleness of a small organisation with smart people has been terrific. So so the impact investing team within SVA again has quite large aspirations to try to help look at how capital can be sort of be a block, and then try to remove that block for organisations that have a social purpose. And so we do, we lend and just social enterprises, and also to particularly for things like sort of disability housing, for example. And then there's my little bit of that puzzle, which is the social impact bond space, or outcomes-based contracting. And I sort of, I've been doing that for about 10 years now, is sort of developing, so creating, negotiating, and then launching and managing social impact bonds. I can talk a bit more about those. Yes.
Yeah. How interesting. So basically doing the finance behind social ventures.
Yeah, exactly. So the nice thing about working in a small organisation is we do get to stretch across a range of different areas. So I also enjoy sort of some of the interaction with people that are in other parts of SVA, sort of, for example, maybe having a consulting engagement or something like that. But it was an opportunity to sort of, I wasn't quite sure this is where I was going to go when I sort of first made a transition, but an opportunity to use some of those skills I had from the financial services world, using the powers for good, so to speak. So yes, sort of trying to sort of look at the that intersection of high finance and the social world, I guess.
Yeah. It's interesting how those skills can be used across, whether you're sort of trying to maximise profit or whether you're trying to maximise outcomes.
Exactly.
So, Elyse, this idea of a social impact bond, not everyone's familiar with what that is. Can you describe briefly what that is and how it works?
Sure. Yeah, it wouldn't be surprising if lots of people have never heard of it. I think we're up to only just around 24 sort of outcomes-based sort of social impact investment contracts in Australia. Not all of them have investor capital involved in them. It's probably less than 20 of them that do. And so at SVA, we've been involved with sort of the majority of those. So they're quite few and far between. So it's perfectly fine if people have never heard of them. It's not this sort of massive asset class that's sort of lurking out there. So the way they work is really, it's predicated on a concept that governments in particular have become interested in, which is looking at flipping around the logic for how they fund social programs. So quite often they sort of just have a grants-based program, and they'll measure activity. So how many people did you see, and how did you crank the wheel, and we'll pay you based on the widgets you produce. and trying to flip that around and say, well, what we're really trying to do is change things for the better. So what we really want to do is understand when we're funding a program, how effective is it being at returning children back to the care of their parents out of home care, or keeping people from reoffending if they've left prison, or keeping people out of hospital if they've got a sort of severe mental health issue. And that then creates this concept of compared to what. So you have to be very clear on who you're working with, measure what happens, and have a sort of yardstick to compare that against. So if you've actually been at all successful in shifting the dial on changing what happens with people. And so at the core is this outcomes-based contract where there's a government payment based on results. And by definition, that has to be sort of later than when the work is done. So the investor capital bit comes in because most non-profit organisations can't afford to wait around to find out whether they're going to get paid for their work. So we source investor capital to fund the actual work being done. So it's kind of like partly bridging finance and partly insurance. So, so then if the work doesn't produce the outcome that's expected, then investors might not get paid. So the return that they receive and even the level of capital that they receive back is linked explicitly to the measured outcomes of the program, usually over like a multi-year term. So so that's the fundamental construct, is sort of program design, payment structure design, and then the capital sourcing, and then a lot of performance management to sort of find out where you got all the assumptions wrong in the first place.
Things never turn out the way we plan at the outset.
Things never turn out the way we planned. In this space where, I think actuaries are very good at understanding risks and thinking about, what's the sort of the full array of things that can happen. So I think one of the things that's been enjoyable for me in this work has been that real, maybe leaning on some old skill sets that are a bit sort of dusty, and so I think that's kind of some of the value that I've been able to bring is to have that probability based almost approach to what could happen, and then what do we do if those different things happen. The thing that's been sort of fun and challenging is that the array of things that can go differently to plan is really large in a space like this, when these are really it's a very nascent space. I mean, there's not many of these instruments that have been done, around the world, really. And it's very different for government, and it's very different for service providers. So everyone's feeling their way in terms of how to sort of have a fair commercial arrangement, I guess, in this very messy space, which is in people's lives, and how you can actually change things for the better.
Sounds like you've got so many different stakeholders and parties involved in this kind of social impact bond. So you've got the government that's wanting to sort of improve outcomes and fund services. You've got the service delivery, whether it's an NGO that's wanting to actually deliver that service and try and maximise the outcome, not just see more people, but actually turn the dial. Then you've got the people themselves who are experiencing their own lives and a whole bunch of other things, not just what that program's doing for them. And then you've got investors who are investing in funding that, which is partly as you said, it's partly insurance and it's partly funding that program, and lots of different moving parts in these social impact bonds.
A lot. And I think one of those really enjoyable things is that most of those parties come to this with that real sense of how do we do something differently that might, that can actually create greater insight, much, building that evidence base so that you're sort of more likely to do what works and do it consistently. So there is that sort of slightly pioneering sense of possibility that all those different parties come to it. But of course, they all do have very different objectives and skill sets and constraints. And I think a big part of the role that sort of organisations like SVA can play is to be that intermediary, in the sense of sometimes it's almost like we're helping translate between the parties who do have different experiences. And because, you know, I'm sort of immersed in a non-profit myself, and all the work we do is in the sort of the social space. You kind of, and this is something that was a big thing for me, was learning almost a brand new language. So you have to learn about the dynamics and the needs of that space, and then to sort of be able to turn around to government who've got, you know, they're very focused on, you know, what's the economic benefits and the sort of contracting structures and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And to be able to sort of bridge those two worlds is you know, a big part of what we do. And there's a lot of that, you know, there's a lot of negotiation that has to happen to sort of take it from concept to you know, a contract that people follow and payments gets made according to, you know, those contracted terms.
Absolutely. That negotiation must be huge, Elyse, when you've got everyone with different objectives and different backgrounds and even different languages.
Yes,
because they're coming from different perspectives.
That's correct. And you know, the investors aren't in the room for those negotiations, so we also have to put the hat on, which is we have to make sure that these are terms that when we actually do go out to the market and say, hey, we've got this thing to invest in, that people say, yes, that risk return sort of positioning is fair, and, you know, we understand, you know, what it's going to do. So we have to have that perspective in the room as well. So yeah, the negotiations, so the development of these contracts can be really lengthy, like you know, up to multi-years sometimes.
Really?
And it doesn't have to be that long, but I think because there's been, again, this sort of real R&D phase of the first ones, the challenge we usually have actually is around data. And again, this is where, you know, it's been interesting seeing some sort of, you know, actuarial involvement in this space. So firms like Taylor Fry, for example, have done a lot of, you know, work sort of, I think, with governments to help them unleash some of the benefits of the data that they've been sitting on. And outcomes-based contracts have been, I think, a good cattle prod for governments to have to do some of the data linkage and data analysis to understand what's actually happening with it as a baseline. So they're often quite interested in saying, yes, we want to sort of improve, you know, stop people from being in hospital. It's like, okay, for this specific population, how many of them go to hospital, you know, today?
So what kind of improvement should we be looking for?
So that having the data in the room to be able to even start the discussions is where some of the blockages are. And then, you know, inevitably you have to, people have to compromise around, you know, what's possible versus what's desirable, and that sense of negotiating both the financial piece, but also just the practicalities of how does it fit into the service system, and how's it going to work on the ground with, you know, with other policies and that sort of thing as well. So yeah,
sounds very complex. So I mean, negotiation isn't one of the actuarial subjects that we take when we're getting qualified. So tell me how did you learn how to negotiate? It sounds like you're doing a lot of it.
Trial and error, I think.
Trial and error, yeah.
Yeah, it's I think for me I think it's probably only sort of dawned on me that sort of negotiation was actually what I was doing after I'd sort of been through this process a few times, because you know, it was, they're always called, you know, joint development phases rather than, you know, negotiations. Really, but yeah, it's very, you know, we're working on this collaboratively, and that is true, but there is still that sort of context of sometimes you just you have to, you know, bridge a gap. And I think for me the thing that I've found most valuable is that I always try to come at it from a position of what's fair and what's kind of right. And I think, and you talked about one of the stakeholders being the people that we're actually seeking to help. And if you start with the position of that end beneficiary in mind, and what, you know, what's their need, and then work back from there in terms of particularly then next the service provider, who is, you know, usually the David to the government Goliath in the room, and so how do you make sure that they're okay in this process? and what does the data tell you? So what's actually the right sort of, or the possible sort of circumstance. You start with what's fair and right, and that makes it very easy to argue passionately for a point. And then the other, I think it's just experience. I think I felt very vulnerable when I first moved into this space because I didn't understand the sector. I was really conscious of my knowledge gap, and
because you come from financial services.
I come from financial services, so I had 2 decades in wealth management, banking kind of thing, and so I knew that space well and felt like I'd kind of got to the point in my career where I could sort of say, yes, I have expertise in sort of, some domains. And that was it was irrelevant and useless when I moved into the social sector. And so had to, work hard and absorb a lot of information to sort of get to the point where I felt that I could speak with authority on things. And so I think the more you do learn and then you can, there is that sort of experience just generally sort of helps you understand even things like understanding the requirements of the people who are negotiating, so that your government, you have to be respectful of what they need to get out of it, and you have to be respectful of what investors need to get out of it, and understanding that then helps you be creative, I think, in sort of coming up with solutions that can work. So so right, there was no sort of negotiation 101
But it does sound like, Elyse, it was quite important for you to understand, what's the ultimate objective? What are we trying to do in terms of the end game here, which is, so in your example, if you're trying to restore children in out-of-home care back to their families, if that's the aim, what does that group need? And then thinking about what about all the other stakeholders who are coming together to play with this social impact bond and understanding what they need as well. And it sounds like by knowing how to speak the language and understanding how social services and social impact works, that gave you the confidence to be able to have those conversations and understand each different party's sort of needs and nuances, I suppose.
Yeah, correct. And then I guess then also understanding the things that I could bring to the table that other people didn't have. So I love having strong partnerships with the sort of service delivery organisations that I work with, and I talk about these projects, each of them, is that they almost are like raising a child, because they do have such a long gestation period, and then they go through all their difficult years, and then eventually mature. And so you have to have, it is almost like a marriage with your partners that took, to raise this child. And so you end up having quite deep relationships with some organisations over the years. And for me, that works really well when there is that sort of mutual exchange of or leaning on each other for the skill set and the wisdom that we each bring. And so again, bringing that actuarial toolkit is a pretty unique thing in this space. And so just the simple things of being able to whip up a financial model and all that sort of thing is I don't know, probably more highly valued by other people who don't have that sort of skill set than you sort of think. So you sort of have to sort of go, oh, that is actually a really useful tool that I can bring, even if it's sort of not at the sort of really pointy end of sophisticated analysis. It's still, but it's fit for purpose, and it can be applied in a way which other people can't do. So
so some of those things in your actuarial toolkit, and they might not be very complicated tools, but some basic analysis or things that you maybe think are easy or simple or take for granted that everyone knows how to do, actually other people can't.
That's it.
So recognising those skills and bringing those to the table, and do you find, because not everybody knows what an actuary is when you're working in human services, so do you find that the word actuary actually makes much sense to people, or how do you sort of convey that you've got that toolkit?
I very rarely do, actually. In some instances, it can be useful to sort of provide context, but I don't. I don't call myself an actuary. I actually resigned from the institute quite some years ago because I couldn't, in good faith, commit to doing the professional development. I was just too busy doing other things, and it was not enough that I was doing. It was like a tick boxes. So I was like, I don't call myself an actuary, but I do sort of proudly communicate that I've got that sort of that heritage, I guess, that background. But it doesn't come up a lot. So for people who know what that is, that might be useful. For people who've never heard of it before, I don't bother really to sort of try to.
So how do you convey those skills? How do you describe what you do without using the term actuary?
I think probably now when we talk to particularly non-profits, or actually even government departments who we might be looking to partner with or sort of explore this space, it's actually we describe more the sort of the different types of work that we do, and it is. But the way we sort of couch that is probably in sort of that we can bring that analytic approach to sort of working through these complex sort of challenges. So it is, but it's funny because it's partly the actuarial sort of numerical piece, but as much as anything else, we do a lot of work just facilitating the thinking about program design and how is that work going to unfold. And again, I wouldn't say that facilitation and program logic design is an actuarial kind of course or background, but I do think that, again, that very logical approach to things helps even in that space. So so I do tend to describe more the phases or nature of the work we do. And to be honest, sometimes it's almost more, I feel like I'm quasi a lawyer these days because I get so, we get so immersed in all the legal contracts and we don't have a lot of money, so I tend to write the first drafts of everything. So, we can provide that sort of support as well. But,
okay. So describing the data, the analysis, the actual process, and really that problem solving, isn't it? You're facilitating problem solving and negotiating, I suppose. So no wonder you're feeling a bit like a lawyer these days.
Yeah.
That negotiation. Challenging, I guess. And I think so. You talk about your heritage as an actuary, and now you're doing all of these different things and negotiating and writing contracts and doing things that you might not have thought 20 years ago that you'd be doing as an actuary.
Even 10 years ago.
Even 10 years ago. So was there a clear path from financial services into the role that you've got? How did you sort of make your way from that financial services actuarial role to what you're doing now?
Yeah, no clear path. I use the word serendipity a lot when I describe this journey, because I was actually quite unstructured in where, when I decided to make a change. I think for me, it just got to a point where I'd had a couple of decades, more than a couple of decades, in the more, even I wasn't doing a lot of classic sort of actuarial work. I had sort of branched out into doing, I'd done things like managed sales teams and strategy roles. And so I'd done a lot of quite different things, even in that career, but it was still in a world that was, I guess, a more familiar, financial underpinnings. There were actuaries around and that was a more familiar and known space, even though I had really kind of branched out into doing other stuff. But I just got to the point where I needed to do something else that was, I guess, that had that sort of that values basis where I felt that my effort and attention was doing something a little bit more meaningful. But I had no idea what that was. I had no idea how to take my financial services sort of
Yeah.
resume and skill set and kind of be of use to the world. I knew that probably frontline service delivery type work wasn't where I would add value, but I didn't know what the path was. So I just, in the end, I just left my old job. I was just too busy in my old job to think about what the new world would look like. So I just had no headspace. So I just left, and then just sort of had a lovely little window where I just sort of talked to lots of people, and it really was that sort of that serendipity of people I knew that knew of some work within SVA, and sort of said, oh, why don't you come and help out with this project that's happening there? And I did that, and then that led to another little kind of project that I got involved with, and then so I got involved with the first sort of social impact bond proposals, and then the very first negotiation, and then that led to the next one, and then that led to the next one. It just sort of incrementally happened, and suddenly 10 years later, that's I've created this little niche for myself. So I think it was just being curious and open, and being lucky. Yeah.
Yeah, so no clear path and serendipity.
That's right. And look, but this particular space was very, even the sort of that broader impact investing space didn't really exist. So SVA had only that was back in 2011. I first sort of went out into the world looking for other things, and we had one person sort of had just started this thing we were calling it social finance at the time, and so the very first piece of work I was going to do was actually just like a landscape, what is this thing, where could we be of use, strategic kind of thinking. So it was just so new that there were no organisations or roles or jobs or what have you. So, and that's a little bit different now. There are sort of more organisations that are sort of playing in this space, some sort of more mainstream that are sort of saying they're playing in this space, some that are really more deep impact. In the environmental space, obviously there's a lot more activity in sort of the impact investing space from the not so much social but environmental perspective. So if I was coming out now, there would be more people to have coffee with, and more actually jobs being posted that you could look at and think about. But it's still not, a huge.
It's not that well known or mainstream. You've really been carving that out in the time that you've been working in the space.
Yes, accidentally, yes.
But so impactfully, and so yeah. So for an actuary that's watching that wants to kind of follow in your footsteps and make a career change into either not-for-profit work or social impact work, what would you suggest in terms of inspiring and enabling some of that serendipity? What actions could they take to help with that path?
And I'm going to preface this with the reality check here, which is you get paid a lot less in the social sector. So I think people need to understand, the trade-offs. Yeah. Yep. And so I was fortunate that I made that change at a point where I was, I'd already had a solid career and was able to be a little risk-taking, I suppose, in terms of what I did. So I just want to kind of acknowledge that not everybody is in that space. So it's, I think, different depending on what phase of your career you're at, or what your aspirations are.
And what's important to you.
And what's important to you, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So for me, there was a sense of what's sufficient, and then, going from there. And then I think it's a little bit do what I say, not what I do, but I think that sort of sense of doing your homework on just who the players are and what types of organisations are, because different people will have different passions, and some people will have a passion for a particular issue or area or sort of, section of the population or what have you. And I think that would be, I wish I'd had that. I didn't have that sort of passion to sort of
You didn't have a clear focus on.
I didn't have a clear focus area. I wasn't. I didn't sort of have the. I'm going to, help with foster kids, or I'm going to, or I'm
climate change, or
climate change, or mental health, or whatever. It was just sort of, I was a bit overwhelmed actually by the sort of the opportunity set or the need set. So I think if people have got that sort of interest or experience that can be a starting point, I think that would be a great thing, because that obviously that will come from a place then of sort of more interest and passion, and you can go from there. So think about what your passions and your interests and your experiences are, and understand who is also working in that space.
Yep.
And then I think there is that, for me, there was that serendipity of because it wasn't really clear how my skill set could be used in this area. Like, it didn't exist really, but it didn't exist. But yeah, sort of thinking about what you know and your skills in a way which is, think about that as like an asset that you can apply in different ways, I think can be a way of sort of reimagining the sort of work that you might do on a day-to-day basis. And then look around for where are there jobs that might, or volunteering maybe as a way in to start with, or whatever it is that sort of might use those assets that you have differently.
Yeah. Amazing. Such great advice, Elyse. Thanks so much for chatting today. I've really enjoyed hearing about social impact bonds and some of the tricky things involved in negotiating and setting those up. And I've really enjoyed hearing about your pathway from being an actuary in financial services, even though it wasn't a clearly defined planned pathway, into being the director of impact investing, and being so heavily involved in these social impact bonds that are making such a new tool has a potential to make so much difference, and shift the dial for some of our more vulnerable community members in particular. So thank you so much for sharing your tips. Really enjoyed your reflections on what actuaries are, and breaking that down into the assets that we have and the skill sets that we have, and not taking some of those more maybe simpler or easier skill sets for granted, but recognising the power of those and how we can use them to make a difference in the world. So thank you so much for sharing all of your experience and tips and wisdom today.
No problems at all. Thank you, Julia, for being interested in all of that. So great chatting to you.
Thanks, Elyse.